All right, we'll reconvene the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. We'll turn our attention to the Carleton Trail College. Thank you so much, Ms. Yeager, President and Chief Executive Officer, for joining us here this morning. And you don't have officials with us, correct? So what I'll do now is I'll turn it over to the auditor. I think they're going to focus on Chapter 2 first, and then we're going to deal with the other two together. I'll turn it over to the provincial auditor. They'll present, then we'll have a brief response on your end, and then we'll open up for the questioning.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members and officials. With me is Mr. Trevor St. John. He's the Deputy Provincial Auditor that was formerly responsible for the portfolio work that includes regional colleges. We will present basically the last two chapters for Carleton Trail combined. And there is 4 new recommendations for the committee's consideration. After each presentation we do, we will pause for the committee's discussion and consideration. I would like to thank management and the CEO and staff of the college for the cooperation that was extended to us during the course of our work. With that, I'll turn it over to Trevor.
Thank you. Chapter 2 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, reports the results of our 2017-18 annual integrated audit of the Carleton Trail College. In 2017-18, Carleton Trail's financial statements were reliable and the college complied with relevant authorities. Other than the following area reflected in our new recommendation, the college had effective rules and procedures to safeguard public resources. Our chapter notes that Carleton Trail did not require the college's college's accounting system did not segregate access for preparation and independent review and approval of journal entries. All 5 entries tested were not independently reviewed and approved. Lack of independent review and approval increases the risk of unauthorized or inaccurate entries made into the accounting records, which could result in decision makers using inaccurate financial information. So on page 22, we recommended the Carleton Trail College require staff to independently review and approve journal entries. I'd like to note that in Chapter 19 of our 2019 report, Volume 2, which is a summary of implemented recommendations, that during 2018-19, the appointed auditor found Carleton Trail College required staff to independently review and approve journal entries. This recommendation we now consider to be implemented. So I'll pause now for the committee's consideration.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Ms. Yeager for brief remarks, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, as soon as we were told by the provincial auditor that we weren't doing this, we set up a process in which all journal entries are monitored and reviewed by either the VP of Finance or our controller. So.
Thank you. I didn't say as well that you'd provided the status update. Should I table that now or should I do it at the end? We did that with the first one. Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for the status update that was provided. Committee members, questions? Ms. Young?
Thank you. Just 2 quick questions on this. I believe one for the auditor's office and then one for Ms. Yeager. This is a recommendation that we see from time to time. So I'm just wondering in terms of the 2018-2019 finding and understanding that that Carleton Trail has annual audits. Why, I suppose, did this pop up in 18-19? Is this a new process sampled, or was this a changing standard?
No, it would have been a control that, like you said, we look for in our annual integrated work as in the course of really the financial statement audit for all agencies. And so really it was a matter of that control processes wasn't being followed appropriately, and then it was rectified and has now been resolved in the next year's audit. So, but we are always looking for, on that financial side, your segregation of duties. You sort of just don't have one person that's doing everything and sort of not being watched closely, because there could be errors or adjustments made to the accounting records that shouldn't be.
Thank you. And then a question for Ms. Yeager. The process remains in place. There's no concerns from the date of its implementation till now?
No.
Thank you.
Any further questions? On this chapter, not seeing any, I'd welcome a motion to concur and note compliance, moved by Mr. Nerline. All agreed? That's carried. We'll move along now to consideration of Chapter 21 and 24, and I'll turn it over to the provincial auditor.
So I'm just going to change it up and give Trevor a bit of a break, and I'll do this one. So Chapter 21 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, reports the results of Carleton Trails College's process to equip its board with the necessary competencies to govern. We completed this audit as well-managed organizations are typically well-governed organization, and effective oversight helps the organization achieve its objectives. For those committee members that were at the CCPAC recent meeting, you will find a number of the concepts that we touch on throughout this presentation would align with those that the Auditor General of Alberta did touch on during his presentation at that conference. Regional colleges are important in educating people to be successful. In order for the board to be effective, it needs to possess or obtain a collective set of competencies. Competencies such as knowledge, skills, and experience include areas such as leadership skills, industry experience, financial expertise, legal expertise, and IT expertise. Not being aware of the gaps in board competencies and not addressing them increases the risk of weakened or ineffective board governance. We concluded the college's processes were effective to equip the board with the necessary competencies to govern, other than the areas reflected in our 4 recommendations. I will now focus on the 4 recommendations. Our first recommendation on page 114, we recommend that Carleton Trail College's board set clear requirements on how often to reassess desired versus existing competencies. We found the college did not set out the frequency of assessing board competencies. The college assessed the collective competencies of the current board only when going through the board recruitment process. Not having clear requirements on how often to specifically assess board competencies may lead to lack of awareness of gaps in competencies and not developing a plan to address them. So, for example, through periodic focus training, resulting in weakened governance. On page 114, we also recommended that the Carleton Trail College's board reassess how often it evaluates the effectiveness of its governance. The college assessed its governance practices 3 times a year. Good practice indicates that annual governance self-assessments would be sufficient. Having a board self-assess its governance too often may result in assessments becoming a mechanical process and diminishing its value. On page 116, we recommend that Carleton Trails College Board have a strategy to address identified gaps in board competencies. We found the college, when developing plans to improve board governance, did not consider the results of the assessment of its current board assessments. Recruitment of a new board was the board's main plan to address identified gaps in competencies of the board. Good practice recognizes actions to improve board governance and strengthen the competencies of board members can include using focused training and/or using external experts to address competency gaps. Relying primarily on member recruitment to strengthen your board competencies increases the risks of a board operating without a sufficient level of needed expertise for a very long time, which may affect the quality of governance and decision-making. And our last and 4th recommendation is on page 117, and we recommend that Carleton Trail College's board develop guidance on making timely recommendations of potential board members to the Ministry of Advanced Education. We noted that the college did not provide potential board member recommendations to the Ministry of Advanced Education to facilitate the timely appointment of board members. The college didn't have sufficient written guidance on the board member recommendation process. Not having a clear timeline and when to start the recruitment process of potential board members causes delays in appointing new members and causes members to potentially serve past their terms. Timely recruitment helps ensure terms of board members are staggered and members don't feel obliged to serve their term once it has expired. In Chapter 24 of our 2020 report, Volume 2, we reported that by September 2020, The college implemented all 4 recommendations. The college's board now evaluates its effectiveness annually and regularly assesses desired versus existing competencies and develops training plans to build competencies when there are identified gaps. The board also developed guidance on making recommendations of potential new board members to the Ministry of Advanced Education to ensure timely appointments. I will now pause for the committee's consideration.
Thank you for the presentation, the focus of the work. I'll kick it over to Ms. Yeager and then open it up for questions.
So these 5, I guess, outstanding recommendations were the result of an audit that was specifically done for our board a few years ago. I was not involved in the process, but now being part of this process as president and CEO, it's clear that all these recommendations are put into place. We do have training plans built for our current board right now, so we have training opportunities for them to identify the gaps that they currently have. So for example, a good example of that would be cybersecurity. So obviously, it might be difficult to recruit a board member with that training, and so we provide that to our board members. Also, it has been a challenge to recruit Indigenous peoples to our board members, to our board as well. And so we try to do as much training as we can in that regard. And we've done 4 seasons of reconciliation training for all of our board members. So trying to identify gaps through training, also through recruitment. Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll open up to the committee for questions. Mr. Hargrave.
On your boards, and there was talk of terms and about serving out terms. How long is the term, and how many terms can one person serve on the board?
You can serve up to 3 years, and you can serve 2 terms.
Yeah. Thank you.
Further questions? Ms. Young.
Thank you. Just a couple questions. Prior to the implementation of these recommendations, how did board member recruitment function? Was it essentially just kind of like local shoulder tapping, or?
Good question, because I wasn't involved in the process, but I understand it based on an ad went out to regional papers all over our region. And now we have an interview process, so sort of an intake, and then we recommend, we send in our recommendations, obviously, to the Minister of Advanced Ed, and they appoint the board members. But before that, I don't believe that we did the interview piece of it. So we gathered the resumes of the interested candidates and then sent those resumes to the ministry for appointment.
And is the interview process, is that conducted by like the board chair and yourself, or?
It is mainly the board and the board chair, yeah.
And then on the subject of, I suppose it would be recommendation 3, that Carleton Trails Board have a strategy to address identified gaps in board competencies. I suppose this is a question I would put both to yourself, specific to Carleton Trail, and then maybe to the auditor as well, just for an understanding of whether this is specific to Carleton Trail or across all of the local colleges. So your professional development funding, essentially, for your board, is that something that you set internally, or is that set by the ministry?
There's sort of 2 sets. So like the governance training that a board member would go through, we get reimbursed half of that cost. So let's just say it's $5,000, we'll get half of that back. But beyond that, so for things like cybersecurity, 4 seasons, those are things that we would budget for in our budget. And I don't know off the top of my head what it is, but I'm guessing around $5,000 to $7,000 a year. Don't quote me on that, because I don't know off the top of my head, but.
Be for the whole board or for each individual board member?
for the whole board.
And I suppose, given the nature of the recommendations and the importance of governance, certainly at the most local of levels, is that level of funding that you feel is sufficient and sustainable for the college?
I think at this point it is, just because I think that we do have board members that currently have many competencies that are of value to us. And normally when the training is done, it's done as a group. If there's individual board members that need additional training, I think it's sufficient. Yeah, I don't know. I can't see at any point in time in which we were concerned about the professional development funds being maxed out.
It's not something when you get down to your budget every year you have to look at as a place to potentially cut. Good. And then is this consistent across how regional colleges would function?
So the scope of our work would have only been at Carleton Trail, so we can't really say whether or not, but I would say that, these are good practices when it comes to board governance, so we would encourage really all government agencies to probably review almost the expectations we had in terms of audit criteria and then the findings, right? So yeah, in terms of other college boards, what we found would probably be, things they would want to read and understand and then figure out if it's working well for them or not.
Thank you. And then my last question with the with the new process for board member recruitment, have you found it has increased the number of applicants or expressions of interest from community members, or fairly static?
We're actually in the middle of recruiting right now, and I would say that we're having a tough time recruiting. Yeah, I think it's just like any other, the impacts of the economy and COVID and that sort of thing. I think that also impacts board member recruitment as well.
And forgive me, I should know, but I don't. Is it a volunteer position, or is there some
There's
compensation?
a small honorarium that's paid. Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all the work on this front. Just out of interest, what is the honorarium for a board member?
It is. So a regular board member gets $110 for a meeting, and then they'll get $110 for prep, and the board chair gets $150.
Well, thanks for that information, and best wishes with the recruitment and all the
Thank you.
work. Not seeing any other questions at this point. I would welcome a motion to concur with recommendations 1 through 4 in Chapter 15 and note compliance. Moved by Chapter 21 and note compliance. Mr. Lemay moves. All agreed? That's carried. And I would welcome a motion to conclude consideration of Chapter 24. Moved by Mr. Nerline. All agreed? That's carried. Very brief recess, 1 minute or two, and we'll bring Northlands College up next. Ms. Yeager, thanks for making the trip. Thanks for your leadership. Any final departing words to us or wisdom, or use it as a
Thanks for
recruitment
making it
effort
easy
to
on me.
board members?
No, just thank you for having me today and having me join you. So.
Right on. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, we'll reconvene the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. We've had Ms. McDougald join us, who's the Interim President and Chief Executive Officer for Northlands College. Thank you so much for joining us and for the work that you and everyone in your institution carry out. We're going to focus on the two chapters first. That'll be the chapters 9 and 21. I'll turn it over to the provincial auditor for presentation. We'll bring it back to you for very brief remarks and then open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members and officials. With me today is Mr. Trevor St. John, the Deputy Provincial Auditor, who was formerly responsible for the portfolio of work that does include regional colleges. We have 3 chapters with regards to Northlands College on the agenda. We plan to put the 2 chapters at the beginning, those first 2 chapters together. There are basically 12 new recommendations for the committee's consideration. After each presentation, we will pause for the committee's discussion and deliberation. I would like to thank the CEO and management and staff at Northlands College for the cooperation that was extended to us during the course of our work. With that, I'll turn it over to Trevor.
Thank you. I'll present the 2 chapters on Northland College purchasing, the original audit and our follow-up. So we completed this audit as strong processes to purchase goods and services supports transparency, fairness, and achievement of best value in purchasing activities. Not having effective purchasing processes increases the risk of not using public resources wisely, increases the risk of fraud, or increases potential legal risks. The college spends about $9 million on goods and services each year. Chapter 9 of our 2019 report, Volume 1, reports the results of our audit of Northlands College's processes to purchase goods and services. We concluded the college had effective processes for purchasing goods and services other than the areas reflected in our 11 recommendations. My presentation will focus on the 11 recommendations. I will also present the results of our first follow-up of the college's progress, which is included in Chapter 21 of our 2021 report, Volume 1. Overall, we found by March 21, the college implemented 2 recommendations and partially implemented 9. So, recommendation 1 on page 146, we recommend Northlands College updates its purchasing requirements so that they align with applicable external trade agreements, establish requirements for staff involved with purchases to declare real or perceived conflicts of interest, and incorporate expectations for use of contracts. We determined that the college's policy to favor local suppliers was not consistent with the terms of applicable external trade agreements, which may result in the appearance the college provided unfair or unequal treatment of suppliers and may expose the college to financial penalties under these agreements.